You're listening to Cultivation Elevated, hosted by Michael Williamson and Anders Peterson, where we discuss vertical farming and the future of cannabis and food production.
All right, what's going on, Durs?
What's up, Michael? How are you today on this
I'm
fine
good.
Thursday?
I'm really good, man. I'm actually excited to talk about this topic. We kind of talk about it in lots of formats, but today we're going to be discussing the benefits and challenges when comparing kind of single-tiered cultivation against multi-tiered cultivation. And so, yeah, we're going to take a deep dive on that. We're obviously from Pip Horticulture. We offer both options, but we do have a lot of exposure over the industry, not just here in the US, but also internationally. And so we'll share a lot of those insights today on this podcast.
Yeah, I love this topic because sometimes you and we get into the weeds on the specifics and minutia of grow rooms and operating and just the industry in general. And at the end of the day, this is the root of what we do here at Pip Horticulture is the multi-level or multi-tier vertical cultivation, whatever you want to call it. And so I think it's good to kind of take us back to the fundamentals and really discuss why we do what we do.
Awesome. Well, let's kick it off with single tier. Do you want to talk about some of the pros of single tiered cultivation strategy and why someone would elect to take that approach?
Yeah. One thing that's become very clear to me talking about this a lot with customers and other growers, versus multi-level is the familiarity with single level, I think is often understated. Fact is that indoor cultivation facilities for cannabis have been built for 30, 40 years or more, 50 years now potentially. And for the majority of the history of indoor cannabis cultivation, it's been a single level facility. And so I think that plays it a lot into the comfort level of cultivators is just the familiarity of it. But times are changing. And in the last 10 years of cannabis, things have accelerated exponentially in terms of the technology available, the cultivation practices, the regulations, the laws. And so just because we've done something for 40 years doesn't mean, it's the right thing to do today. I would say another pro of single level, um, I think one of the main ones we hear is just ease of access, not having to access a second layer. But
It,
like we've seen a lot, sometimes depending on the single level facility, these plants are so tall and the tables are set at such a tall height. It's funny. Well, you pointed it out to me, and it's funny to me to now go into a single level grow and see how many people are standing on step stools or step
on
ladders.
ladders. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Right.
I
So like
never
if
realized that until you told me that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, right, most people have some type of rolling bench or some kind of bench system, and that could be anywhere from, 2 feet off the ground to even 3 feet off the ground. And then the cultivators that are really pushing high yield, they're trying to hit that 90 to 120 grams a square consistently. They're growing every bit of a 6 or 7 foot tall plant. So now you have a 6 or 7 foot tall plant on top of a 2 or 3 foot tall table. You got like an 8 or 9 foot situation. So if you're going to manage the top of your canopy, if you're going to do defoliation, any kind of trellis work, guess what you're getting on? A ladder.
Yeah.
Um, so, when people are like, "Oh, I don't like to use, I don't multi-tier is difficult for access. You got to have ladders and things like that." And it's like, well, the nice thing about multi-tiers evolved really quickly. We've
Mhm.
moved past ladders and now have platforms and catwalk systems and have basically created a floor at whatever level we want within 2 inch increments.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things that I like about single tier is it's simple. It's easy. Well, I won't say it's easy. It's simple. It's pretty straightforward. It requires less complex setups. Um, when would a single tier system make sense? It makes sense based on typically your budget. A lot of people would like to go to multi-tier because they realize how much more canopy you achieve, but you do have a higher capex cost, and if you don't have the budget for it and you have a license, you have to find a way to get that revenue generated. So that all being said, I think single tier can make a lot of sense when you have maybe a low ceiling height. I think single tier, and if we're going to talk about HPS, that's a whole other story, but single
Mhm.
tier at HPS as an example, if you had a really low kilowatt hour, you were in a really rural area where expanding horizontally is not a
Yeah.
problem. You just have like a giant space anyways. It's an existing building. Let's say it's I don't know, 100,000, 200,000 square feet. Well, maybe a single tiered setup does make sense. And that's why we offer them at PIP.
hmm Well, and I think when we say single level generally, it doesn't mean every room in a facility is single level. I still see a lot of single level flower rooms in a facility that has multi-leveled veg and mom. But you're right. I think I like to look at traditional vertical farming quite a bit, non-cannabis vertical farming, because the margins on those crops are far less. The crop value is far less than cannabis. The light levels are far less, which drives all the engineering challenges, right, of cannabis. And so when you study that market, you tend to see that vertical farms are viable and profitable in certain geographies. Geography and market pressure have a lot to do with it in non-cannabis vertical farming. And I think that with cannabis, because of the crop value, it's extended those geographies to a lot more areas that make it viable and profitable and make a lot more sense. Um, so I think geography, when you're talking about single versus multi-level, makes a big deal. Like you mentioned, if you have the space to grow horizontally and expand, if let's say your desert hot springs or, somewhere in the desert or somewhere in a more rural area. Um, but an interesting thing to me is oftentimes the zoning and areas that have access to the greatest amount of utilities, power, or gas, are typically not in these rural areas. They're closer to denser urban areas. And for these cannabis facilities to be zoned appropriately and to distribute their product, right? Say you're vertically integrated and have a dispensary, you're going to be in a dense urban area. That is where it's become more and more common and almost a no-brainer. You kind of have to go multi-level in that scenario because the closer you move to a metropolitan area, the harder it is to find a real big building. And
Absolutely. Especially at a reasonable rate.
yeah. And so again, this geography kind of conversation dictates a lot of it, and cannabis is a unique crop in terms of that it expands that geography significantly due to its value. But then again, the legal situation of cannabis permits it to be close to a lot of power and a lot of gas. So it
Okay.
pushes it in closer to an urban area.
Yeah, let's flip the coin a bit. So, let's talk about the cons of single tier. Single tier setups don't always maximize the space.
hmm
Even with traditional rolling benches, if you don't have a mobile carriage where you can float your aisles completely, you end up getting shortchanged inevitably. The other one that I notice is when you're growing a 6 or 7 tall plant, there's a lack of light penetration down into the bottom parts of the plant. And there has been some solutions that are coming up. We're seeing a big kind of movement there with under canopy or intra canopy lighting to make up for that. And, obviously it was an issue because now there's a lot of different companies that are offering under canopy and intra canopy lighting here in the last 2 years. They're trying to solve that problem. So it's kind of a known problem. But yeah,
hmm
less light penetration, more risk for microbial issues, potentially greater chances of having C grade or larvae buds below. Those are the two big ones that I kind of see is that you're not maximizing your total cubic footprint and your square footprint, and you're not getting enough light penetration deep into the canopy. But what else do you see?
Yeah. Well, definitely the fact is you're not maximizing the space. And so the way I like to think about it too is let's say you have two facilities that both have 25,000 square feet of flowering canopy, right? But the single level facility requires a much larger building to house that 25,000 square feet of flowering canopy, whereas the multi-tier facility maybe is 30 to 40% smaller. Let's assume it's all dedicated cultivation, not, vertically integrated. Well, from a business standpoint too, that larger building now has inherently more fixed costs associated with owning that property and operating that property. Even just as a simple example, the property tax associated with a building, a commercial building, 30 to 40% bigger. I mean, that adds up on top of all the other expenses of running a cannabis business. The margins are slim these days. I'm looking for opportunities everywhere to reduce my costs, whether it's software costs, operating costs, real estate costs, labor. Um, we have to be, essentially pinching pennies to make sure that dollars and cents make sense in our cannabis
Sure.
businesses. So, to me, that's a big one, especially in these areas like California, where I'm from. If I can acquire a property that is 40% smaller, but can produce the same amount, that 25,000 square feet of canopy, for example, I'm going to do that all day. It's less of a burden, I guess, on my business.
Yeah, the other thing that I'll comment on, and this does fluctuate a little bit from site to site because no two grows are identical, that's for sure. But that being said, typically in a single tiered rolling bench setup, let's say fixed leg rolling bench, there's typically an extra row or even two sometimes of lights because they're blanketing
Hmm.
the whole ceiling. Where in a mobile multi-tiered system, as you know, the light is fixed to the rack itself. So as the rack moves, the light moves with it. Well, when you're ceiling mounted, you're basically trying to, you know, blanket the whole room. In order to do that, you have these fixed aisles in some cases. And so typically you'll have at least one extra row, like I said, if not two extra rows of light. So there's an additional CapEx there. There's an additional OpEx as well that you don't typically have in multi-tier because the light stays with the rack and it's integrated with the rack. So wherever the rack goes, wherever the canopy goes, the light goes. So
Yeah.
that's just another one that people don't think about as much.
Well, and maybe this is a little nitpicky or whatever, but you and I have learned a lot from greenhouse production as well, large scale commercial greenhouse production, whether that's cannabis or not. Um, you're the efficiency guru, right? Value versus non-value adding touches, all this. And one of the first lessons I learned in large scale commercial greenhouse production is how often these managers count people's steps. Physically, how long does it take one person to complete a task? How many steps does it take for them to get around the building, to get around the property, to get around the greenhouses and complete a task? Are there tools right there? Do they have to do back and forth and crisscross? And it's, for a larger indoor facility, the larger horizontal space to travel around a facility adds time and steps. And when you have a significant amount of tasks to complete every week, those add up on a crew.
I'll give you an
So with,
example.
yeah,
Sorry to cut you off. I'll
no,
give you an
you're fine.
example because you're 100% spot on. I sometimes refer to these facilities, it could be a greenhouse, indoor facility, doesn't really matter, as labor labyrinths. And, typically I'll go in with a stopwatch and I'll just start watching and timing stuff. And I did this experiment the first time in a 5 acre greenhouse facility, and we had 1 acre flowering zones. So pretty big flowering zone. Took us about 5 days to harvest
Yeah, an
in the
acre's like
beginning.
45,000 square feet.
Yeah. So
Big.
I think we had 42,000-ish plants in that space at the during that first year. And so I was constantly evaluating labor. And what I learned during that process was, and this was in California, Monterey County, if I could shave 5 seconds off of any one task, for that task, it ended up saving me like 27 total hours. And when you look at what we were paying people in California back then, which I want to say was somewhere between 18 and $22 an hour for general labor, it was seconds cost you hundreds of dollars. A lot of people don't
Hmm.
realize that. And they're like, yeah, we've been doing it this way people just get comfortable. So I'm constantly, when I go into a new facility and, I'm engaged to do so, I typically will track three things through what I call the labor labyrinth. It's people, plants, and waste. And I'm trying to streamline as much of that stuff as I can. It's amazing when you start to like actually plot this out and draw it on top of like a set of drawings, and you'll show an operator or an owner or supervisor what their workflow looks like. I refer to it as a spaghetti diagram. And in a spaghetti diagram, you're looking for like long, uncooked pieces of like spaghetti pasta. It's when the spaghetti gets cooked and it's all in circles, or you have people who are spreading biological issues. They're
Hmm.
crisscrossing over each other. So I'm always trying to streamline that and eliminate as many touch points as possible.
Yeah.
I know we're getting into lean
Well,
stuff
I
now, so
mean,
we'll curb that for another talk. But
I think it's only natural too then to address, maybe let's move on to some of the cons of multi-tier. And then we can kind of finish on some of the pros, just to end it off. But, you know, that is one of the biggest, I would say, concerns growers have transitioning to multi-tier is the labor aspect of accessing the second tier. And historically, that was a concern at first before different solutions and technologies were developed, because in the early days, people were on all ladders or they were on scaffolding, which limited the amount of people that could access the upper tier to one or two at a time. So when you had a task like transplanting or harvesting or defoliation, you had kind of a fire team going of passing stuff up to this one or two people on these elevated platforms. When PIP came out with the Elevate platform system, the scaffolding system, it changed the game in terms of being able to have an entire team up there. It also limited the amount of steps to take it. I mean, you slide in these decks from the front of the row across rails, and then instead of having one or two people up there, you can have an entire team of people working on that row or multiple rows at a time. I was in a grow just on Tuesday. They have 44-foot carriages and they were using the Elevate platform. They had 5 people up there prepping for a harvest, kind of stripping some big fan leaves. And I saw 2 people switch the Elevate platform from one row to the next in less than 5 minutes.
yeah, I was gonna say 3 minute, 3 to 5 minutes typically. You're not gonna
Yeah,
give this group a shout out? What farm are you at?
it was the homies at Oak Fruitland in
Oak
Oakland,
Fruitland.
California.
Yeah,
I
they
have to
run a
say,
really lean, awesome shop.
yeah, and that was actually probably more people than they typically have doing that. They were just trying to get it all done, but they are a very lean, very efficient shop, um, that grows great product. And the consistency blew my mind. I don't want you're going to dive me into a rabbit hole on this, but real quickly, one of the things they shared to me that blew my mind was they don't grow super high yielding strains. They grow quality strains. And almost all of their catalog is these kind of middle to high yielding quality varieties. And they're consistently yielding harvest to harvest within 3 grams a square foot.
Wow.
In a room with 9,000 canopy square feet, I mean, the whole facility has 80,000 flowering canopy square feet in Oakland. And their harvests are plus or minus 3 grams a square foot. I don't think I'd ever heard that before. That blew my mind
Sure.
that they are that consistent. So sorry,
Well, and
I
we
don't
saw,
want to delve
no,
into
it's
that,
okay.
but
We saw that on
it's
site there too, with like how consistent they are in their practices, and the uniformity is key. We know this.
yeah, I was asking them their yields and they're giving me a super specific like 2 to 3 digit value. And I'm like, good for you guys.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah, it's good to know
So,
your data.
anyways, but
All
yeah,
right,
I
so
think, the access, right, is that's one of the biggest concerns we hear sometimes. And I think that problem has wholly been solved, especially um, considering the new solutions that have been out there. That's a lot more efficient. And it's not expensive to do either, you know.
the other thing on that note too, so you highlighted you saw, 4 people on top of the Elevate platform system. Depending on the situation and what the height of that platform ladder is, it's not uncommon to see another 4 people on like mechanic stools or rolly chairs underneath the catwalk, also working on the single tier. So
Hmm.
that's also kind of an interesting component that I wasn't really anticipating when we did the Elevate platform system. But just like anything else, you produce a great product and you get it in the hands of great growers, and they find optimal ways how to use it. So we do see that commonly in the field. So you're able to
Yeah.
not just work on the top tier simultaneously, you can work on the bottom tier just underneath that catwalk system.
Yeah. I would say one of the other cons is or challenges, I would say, with multi-tier, like you pointed out, is the complexity of the engineering and design of these rooms, compared to a single level room. But I hate almost using the word complexity. It's not more complex in my mind. This goes back to my early comment about familiarity. It's not more complex, it's just newer. And I
Hmm.
always like to reframe that in people's minds. Like multi-tier cultivation in cannabis really only began 7 years ago. I mean, give or take, I mean, when LED fixtures really began to be adopted by cultivators, like the Fluent Spider when that first came out.
Yeah, it was 2015. I remember it clear as day because we had
Yes.
Green Hoss. We started in 2013, and it was a struggle to tell people about multi-tier. They'd look at you at the trade show and be like, "I'll never grow on 2 tiers." And I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah. And
Uh,
so it's like, the advent of these more efficient close proximity LED horticultural fixtures, they really made multi-tier cultivation viable for the first time 8 years ago, roughly, right?
hmm
And so even back then, multi-tier single level facilities were being built commercially by engineers. They were still figuring that out, how to build a large scale commercial indoor plant growing factory in terms of the engineering of the electrical, the power, the plumbing, everything. And then you add the second layer, which is a completely different approach and not more complex, just un less understood because it's newer. We have 40, 50 years of trying to figure out how to build a single level grow room. You get these, you get habits as a designer. And the multi-level room just requires a different approach. It's not more complex, but I think some people view it as more complex because there's less best practices and standards and knowledge around it, which is I think what you and I are trying to help solve so that people are less intimidated by it or confused by how to build an efficiently operating multi-tier room.
Yeah, it is amazing how much like grower confidence, grower experience plays into some of that decision making for some investors as well. They're like, our grower says this, and they'll say things like, "Oh, I have a brown thumb. You got to talk to Tony or Sally or whoever the grower is." Like we kind of just funnel everything through that person. If that person's never grown multi-tier and they know that maybe they're incentivized based off of some kind of performance, it can be stressful for that person to, say, I'm confident enough that I can figure out the multi-tier. It's an easier thing to say, I know single level HPS or I know single level LED. I know I can, there's no guarantees in cannabis, but people like to say things. I can guarantee our success if we go this route first. And then
Yeah.
maybe we can graduate to something more, more advanced or multi-tier, down the road.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. There's a few things that could be worrisome for cultivators making that switch. Is a lot of them are HPS growers and have never made the switch to LED still, right? So now they're intimidated by going to LEDs for the first time and now doing a multi-level facility. And the competitiveness of the cannabis industry does not allow cultivators to experiment as much as I think they would like. A lot of cultivators get caught in what their comfort zone is, what they're familiar with. And when you start changing things in cultivation, unless you have a really, really good understanding of the levers to pull and how to balance the system, um, things can go wrong. You can lose yield, you can make less money on that harvest, and there's just not the ability to do that today in cannabis as much as people would like. So they get caught in a comfort zone. I urge growers all the time to get out of that comfort zone and try new things because it ultimately makes you a better grower when you know how to balance all of these variables and pull these levers. But yeah, there is that kind of fear, and to an extent, I understand it. But I think at the end of the day, it makes you a better cultivator, kind of pushing yourself. We started doing multi-tier, it made me learn the genetics much more in the library than anything else. I had to learn more about the stretch rates, planting densities, growth rates, plant heights, all these things, and it really made me a better grower at the end of the day.
Nice.
Um, so, hey, do you want to move on to kind of some of the pros? I mean, we've kind of been touching on them, but
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously space efficiency at the
yeah.
core of multi-tier mobile stuff and what PIP horticulture has done for 40 years is maximize space.
Hmm.
So multi-tier setups allow for vertical growing, maximizing the use of space, enabling more plants to be grown in a smaller area. And we can quantify that for you. And this is where it gets really interesting. So
Hmm.
let's say we'll just say a 1,000 square foot room. Now, on a typical single tier setup, let's call it fixed leg, rolling bench top, your canopy is going to be what, 65, 70% of that space?
Yeah, give or take, depending. I mean, it can be up to 80%, but that's give
With
or
like no
take.
no no circulation space to work in whatsoever. But
Yeah.
let's call it 75%. So 1,000 square feet. So you have 750 square feet of canopy. Now, just at 2 tiers alone, you have the exact same layout, except we'll make it mobile, which means you're probably going to get an extra row in.
Hmm.
But we'll just say conservatively, you're at 150% canopy and or I'm sorry, excuse me. You're at 1,500 square feet of canopy and 1,000 square foot space.
That's right.
And then if you get to choose your building and build your building, or you go, hey, I got 20-foot ceiling heights, you're pretty prime for third tier and flower. And that's where
Hmm.
the numbers get real rich. So that third tier, that's going to put you at, what is that, 225? I'm doing that wrong.
2,250.
Thank you. You created 2,250 square feet that physically doesn't exist in a 1,000 square foot canopy. I mean, I think that's the beautiful thing about what we do at PIP and multi-tier is we create canopy that physically cannot exist on a single plane or tier.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing to me how many of these commercial buildings we go into where they have 18, 20-foot ceilings and they're growing in a single level and you look up and it's this massive cubic area that is underutilized. And now, I didn't used to, but now I go into Zoom to look at it and I go, God, there's all this money being left in the air, above my head. That's just dollar signs to me now, or more yield, more plants, and it's like kind of hard to see why they wouldn't do it, especially with ceiling heights like that.
Well, when people talk
Um,
about their cost of goods sold, oh, I got to run lean, I got to do this, I got to do all that stuff. Like at the end of the day, the most impactful thing you can do to reduce your COGS or your cost of goods sold is top line revenue. It is
mhm.
hands down. You can go micro tweak all the little stuff, but if you're trying to grab that 80% of the pie, it's top line revenue. And the best way to drive top line revenue is increase your yield. Best way to increase your yield, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but you're never going to catch up. You can totally optimize a single tier and get it to, I don't know, 120 plus grams a square foot every harvest, which is very hard to do.
Hmm.
And you still don't even come close to what just a two-tiered system can do on an average day. So at
Yeah,
the,
I was gonna say it just reminded me what you're saying of a recent project I was talking to the owner with. They're limited regulatory wise to 14,000 square feet of canopy, I believe the number was. And he was looking at purchasing a 25,000 square foot building. He wanted to be vertically integrated with extraction, kitchens, distribution, office space, all that, So he was looking to put 14,000 square feet of canopy into a 25,000 square foot building. And he was planning all single level cultivation.
impossible.
And there were very few properties that he, could find that fit his needs. And I said, well, do you have properties in the 15 to 18,000 square foot range you can find? He goes, oh yeah, there's tons. I said, okay, I can fit 14,000 square feet of canopy in that building. He's like, really? I was like, yeah, that's no problem. Like the example you just said, 1,000 square foot room with 20 something foot tall ceilings, you can fit 3 levels, over 2,000 square feet of canopy in 1,000 square feet, right? So, and it's like, he was like, he could see the light bulbs going off and he goes, oh my gosh, my options for where I can build this project of mine have just skyrocketed and I can do it in such a smaller space. And all the buildings he looked at had like 22-foot ceilings, something like that. So,
That's a
it was
great story.
perfect.
And
But he
it's
was
100%
limited.
correct. Yeah,
He was limited ultimately about how much canopy he could produce. So he's maximizing his canopy footprint, but he's limited on that, but he's then also now buying a much smaller property to fit that in,
totally. No, I
still
love that. And
maintaining a
if you
compliance.
think about that too, right? Like if you, let's say you're leasing the space, but you'd much rather get more canopy and have less of a square foot per lease cost. You don't have to carry that
Hmm.
burden of a larger facility. And like you said, it just opened up a whole new realm of possibilities of where he could be. Maybe the available power is already there in that smaller building.
Hmm.
You start to think about things like that. It's all about getting to revenue as fast as you can before you're operating. So any of
Hmm.
those little shortcuts that get you to your first crop the fastest are so critical. I love that story. What state is that? 14,000? Is that Illinois?
It was Illinois.
Yep.
Look at you. You know your stuff, man.
Yeah, yeah.
God.
Hey,
So
when you live and breathe this 8 days a week, some of it sticks in the head sometimes.
yeah. One final thing, or maybe we can wrap this up soon, but another thing that the guys from Oak Fruitland were talking to me about the other day was they have some single level rooms. You know, the facility's been retrofitted over the years from single to multi-level. And now they've told me they're never building another single level facility. You know, they just acquired a new spot. They're going to be expanding, and they're retrofitting it all to multi-level after they've adopted this and gotten used to it. And they're doing very well as a business. I was asking him about his yields and his single level versus multi. And, you know, a lot of growers assume that going multi-level, you get these really lower yields for some reason. And I think that was a byproduct of, like we talked about earlier, poor mechanical system design, HVAC and airflow. You know, someone putting multi-tiered racks in a room designed for a single level cultivation, and then they don't get good yields, and they blame it on the fact that it's multi-level, not the engineering to design for that room, right? And so we can get into that in another conversation, but essentially this facility's mechanical designs work very well for multi-level. And like I said, they're on average between like 78 and 81 grams a square foot every single harvest within 3 grams a square foot. And I said, okay, what's your single level LED room doing? He goes 80 to 83. So they are within 2 grams a square foot of their single level yields. And his face lights up. He goes, yeah, but I get twice as much in that room.
Exactly.
So a 2 gram a square foot reduction in loss is all he's experiencing, but in double the production in that footprint.
Beautiful. I mean, that's it. That's why we do what we do, and we're so passionate about it. And we're trying to get this information out to people. That all being said, please smash like all the buttons and all that fun stuff. We bring you these podcasts free of any commercials, really as an educational tool, a reference tool. You know, Anders and I hope that we stir maybe debate with you, make you think about things differently. You can find us. You can find us on Instagram individually, as a company. You can email us. We're not hard to find. You can even go through the general inquiry and say, "Hey, I want to talk to Michael and Anders." And you know, we're here. Yeah, we're here. We're here to have these discussions. We want to debunk things. We're all about productively being challenged as well. We're honest folks, and we're trying to put out just really good information for growers so that we can give you the best tools to be successful.
Yeah. Thanks for the conversation, Michael. It was good talking
Always
to
a
you
pleasure,
again.
brother. Yeah. Talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
All right. Peace.
Bye.